Paul has a counter theory called minimal witnesses, and I want to give anybody in my audience who maybe hasn't seen it on Paul's channel. Do you have like? Are you willing to take a few minutes and go
Sure,
over it?
we can.
Do you have your slide?
I will give the
The slide
abbreviated
can help.
short version. So each of these slides is essentially going to be a chapter. Maybe, it could be a chapter in a book if someone was ever to write a book. And so, but briefly in as few sentences as possible. And some of these are more important than others, but I included them all. Slide one, the assumption is that Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher in the first century. And I don't necessarily go into support. You can ask me questions if you want to know why I'm supporting these. This is just the theory. Jesus said the wrong thing to the wrong person and got himself killed on a cross. As was most common for crucifixion victims, Jesus's body was disposed of in a way that could no longer be remembered the next day. Jesus had 12 disciples, but all but two of them completely disappeared to reliable history. We have no idea what happened to them except for Peter and John. Peter, whose dear friend passed away, suffered what 14% of all adult humans suffer, and that is something like a post bereavement death experience, which can include all kinds of modes of hearing and seeing and touching, but none of that matters. And it doesn't even matter if it was specifically post bereavement death experience. Peter came to think that Jesus was still alive. He shared this news with John and James, James, the brother of Jesus. They came to accept what he said and decided to join him in continuing their beloved Jesus's ministry. Stories about Jesus began to spread all over the region, not from the disciples, but stories of people who believed in Jesus. And every time they told the story, they learned what grew new converts. And the stories that were better at winning converts were the stories that were repeated most often. A few years later, a Pharisee named Paul, who was persecuting Christians, suffered potentially with something along the lines of a post traumatic stress break because from the guilt of persecuting these Christians, potentially even murdering Christians, depending on the story. And in that, whatever it was, Paul came to think that he also heard from Jesus and that Jesus directed him to become a Christian. A few years later, Paul actually met Peter and John and James. We don't know what they said. We don't know what they talked about, but we know that they met. Decades later, men who never met Jesus, Greek speaking men who lived entirely different places, began to take some of those stories that people were taking about Jesus, began to take some of the actual memories that some of the people would have had, probably some core legitimate memories about Jesus in there, like that he was from Nazareth. They combined that with their own research into the Old Testament. And as Greek writers, they also would have included tropes from Greek literature, as all Greek writers would have done. And they used those to create gospels. They also referenced each other when they were doing this. In the years that followed, it's unfortunate, but some Christians were troublemakers, and the troublemakers ended up getting in trouble. But it wasn't widespread. It wasn't systematic. Not for many hundreds of years. For hundreds of years, the Christians who were a little vocal caused some problems. They were in trouble, but there wasn't this mass persecution. That did come later for a very brief amount of time. But then in stepped Constantine, who became a Christian on his own right from his own vision, not from the Gospels or from anything else. And yada, 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 modern Christianity. All the minimal facts that Gary has presented, and even more, but we didn't go into, are completely explained with this very mundane, very boring story of things that happen all the time. No resurrection required.
I wanted you to take a minute to show everybody that. One, because I like it. I like how succinct it is. And two, because most people would come up with the counter, "Oh, well, how do you explain their" even
Right.
though you picked them apart, you still agreed that I guess when I look at it, how many would I give? Jesus died, I don't care about. I would agree that 3 people had an experience, I guess, of the minimal
Mhm.
facts. Those are the ones that I would be like, "Yeah, okay. Something needs to account for that." 3 people believed a thing. 2 of them, I would say for sure, I would say had experiences, although, like, even Peter didn't need to have an experience, and there's nowhere that says he had an experience outside of that creed. There's nowhere he says that he had an experience, Peter and James. But anyway, you need to account for those somehow, and I think
Right.
that that succinctly kind of accounts for those. So, go.
And yeah, and so this is specifically geared to, the minimal facts arguments. I know some people want to argue about other things, but the minimal facts is just the way most Christians argue for the resurrection. So it's a relevant counter proposal.